In the first chapter of Genesis, we read that God created all the creatures in the sea, all the birds in the air, all the mammals and the livestock, all the creatures that move along the ground, all according to their kind. There are 6,495 species of mammals in the world, 18,000 species of birds, 33,600 species of fish, and over 900,000 species of insects. Why did God create so much diversity? Is God still active in the creation? If so, to what end? What role do humans have to play in this ongoing creation? Speaking of humans, there are around 200 countries in the world, 650 different ethnic groups, 4,300 religions, and 6,500 spoken languages. What have you learned about yourself, the world, or about God from someone from a different country, religion, ethnic group, or language group? What is God's intention for so much human diversity in the world? How are you living in accordance with those intentions?
All of us, at some fundamental level, have a sense that the world as it is not the world as it is meant to be. My tradition uses the categories of sin and evil to describe that which is out of alignment with the divine intention for the world. Your tradition may have other ways of thinking about this. Our different traditions have different stories and different ways of understanding how we got into the situation we are in. But whatever that looks like in your tradition, I'd like us to think for a moment about what our role is, our role in all of this. In my tradition, we don't get to simply blame the state of the world on outside forces. In other words, we don't get to say that we are simply the victims of circumstance, but must acknowledge that we have some responsibility for perpetuating and collaborating with the forces that have brought the world into a condition that it needs saving from. Many of our traditions have some version of the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And yet history and present experience show that we are really not very good at following this rule. So what is the answer? What is the solution? How does your faith address your part in what is wrong with the world and empower you to change both your attitude and your actions?
The traditional Haggadah, the book used during the Seder ritual, proclaims Avadim Hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Pharaoh in a land known as Mitzrayim. Many have identified the place the Bible calls Mitzrayim with modern-day Egypt, but the word Mitzrayim also means a narrow place. Ultimately, the geography is not what is significant. Our story is made universal by the fact that all of us have known narrow places in our lifetimes, whether we are physically constrained or whether we feel constricted by emotional or sociological factors, by economics or political oppression. The story of Passover reminds us to be dissatisfied with a status quo that positions some as subservient to others. All of the faith traditions represented in this year's Interfaith Seder have known more than their share of oppression over the course of their respective histories. Many continue to be targets of bigotry and misunderstandings to this day. As we celebrate one narrative of a people's freedom from a narrow place, let us renew our pledge to work together to build a world in which all may know the blessings of liberty and freedom.
Rather than list the 10 plagues in the Bible, we've been asked to reflect on 10 modern plagues, things that keep us from being our best selves. I understand this in both individual as well as collective senses, our communities, our society, and our global family. With these instructions, I immediately thought of words the Archbishop of Sweden has been using in many of her talks in recent years. Bishop Antje Jackelin was professor of theology at my seminary in Chicago before she became bishop, and she names 5 P's in what she calls a poisonous cocktail too many are drinking these days. They are the plagues she sees from her global perspective and context. Populism, polarization, protectionism, post-truth, and patriarchy. In order to bring the list to the biblical 10, I had to add 5 of my own. So the following are plagues I see as a Christian leader in the United States today. Persistent white supremacy, oppressive and crippling poverty, perpetual self-loathing, pernicious ecological destruction, and finally, hearkening back to the prophet Jeremiah, preaching peace when there is no peace, preaching peace without doing justice. We can't survive or thrive. We cannot breathe or rest when we perpetuate these. Similar to the biblical plagues, may these modern versions be unbearable realities that push us to do what we need to do for liberation and justice. And may all of the pharaohs in our world, the ones inside of ourselves, the ones in our religious traditions, and the ones in our societies and institutions, finally release their grip on power and let God's people and God's whole creation go.
At First Mennonite Church, we don't have too many practices of ritual washing. But once a year, we do gather to remember and reenact the holy moment when Jesus knelt to wash the feet of his disciples. Our tradition holds that this event came during the Passover meal that the Rabbi Jesus would have observed together with his closest friends and disciples. So it seems especially appropriate to mark this Interfaith Freedom Seder with the practice and power of foot washing. It was at that meal with his disciples that Jesus is said to have wrapped a towel around his waist. And then we're told that he poured water into a basin. And he began to wash his disciples' feet. Some of them objected, offended by the notion that their leader would debase himself so thoroughly as to do the work of a servant. But Jesus strongly insisted on washing their travel-worn, tired feet. He taught that to become a servant to others is the greatest act of love. Love one another, he said, as he finished drying the feet of his closest friends, some of whom would soon betray and renounce him when he was banded a criminal and executed by the Roman governor. Love one another, he said to them. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now that I have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. Follow my example, he said, for I tell you, no servant is greater than their master. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So once a year at First Mennonite Church, we repeat this awkward habit of washing each other's feet as a declaration of the love that we learn from Jesus and share with one another, as a way of placing our hearts and our bodies in tune with the great love that holds together all of God's creation. These COVID days, since we're unable to gather, we've started a new foot washing tradition. In response to Jesus' call to serve and love, we've begun collecting a foot washing offering. And for the second year in a row, that offering will be given as mutual aid for immigrants and refugees in Champaign County. May all of our lives be a blessing for travel-worn, tired feet, now and always. Amen.
A pleasant change for me during the pandemic is that I now rarely eat meals at my desk while working. Prior to the pandemic, that had become a bad habit of mine, where I would eat with one hand while typing or clicking away with the other. My eating was not done with any real level of consciousness. In the year that I have now worked almost entirely from home, my meals have been almost always with my family, thanks be to God. I linger quite a bit more over the meal, enjoying it with more mindfulness. I think that's good for my stomach and for my soul. As I return to working from this office more, I must be careful to not let old habits slip back in. In various Christian traditions, there are different understandings of the substance of the bread that we partake of in the Eucharist. All agree, though, that the bread we eat is sacred or holy in some way. The pastor quotes from scriptures that say Jesus took bread and blessed it. The bread is made holy, which really just means dedicated to God. The bread is set apart from its normal, ordinary use. When we eat the bread during Holy Communion, we might chew it a bit more slowly than usual. We treat this particular bread, this holy bread, with due reverence, for it is set apart for God. Perhaps we might think of all of our food in that way, though. Yes, certain bread is consecrated in religious observances, but isn't all of our food a gift from God to be appreciated? And aren't we all set apart for God's purposes? And aren't all of those who are a part of the process of us receiving food, farmers, bakers, grocers, etc., holy? Maybe this pandemic can teach us to slow down a bit and be mindful of all of the gifts of God's creation, enjoying them with reverence and gratitude to God and to others. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth.